Welcome back. Today, we are tackling a word that is, well, it's absolutely everywhere.
It really is. It's the holy grail of modern politics, isn't it?
The thing nations fight wars over, the thing everyone just assumes is inherently good.
Without necessarily stopping to ask why.
Exactly. And we're not just talking about voting booths and campaign stickers today. We're looking at a 2,500-year-old argument about whether human beings are actually capable of not destroying one another when left in charge.
It is definitely a heavy hitter. And it's a concept that feels so familiar, but when you really start to peel back the layers, it's just full of contradictions.
And full of arguments that have been raging since the days of togas and chariots. Now, before we launch into all of that, I need to make sure everyone understands the setup here.
It's a bit different.
It is. You are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis. And today, we're looking at Mortimer Adler's essay on democracy.
Specifically, this is the essay found in Volume 1 of The Great Ideas, a Syntopicon.
Volume 1. Okay. And the Syntopicon. That sounds like a transformer, but it's essentially the index to the great books of the Western world, right?
Essentially, yes. It's the intellectual map.
Yeah.
And to orient us, in Volume 1, democracy is the 16th great idea.
And it sits alphabetically right between definition and, which feels just perfect. We spend our lives trying to define it and even more time desiring it. But Adler's not just giving us a dictionary entry here.
No, not at all.
The mission for this deep dive is to explore democracy not just as a mechanical system, but as this massive ongoing argument about human nature itself.
Exactly. Adler frames this so well.
Yeah.
He argues that democracy isn't just a form of government, it's a question. And the question is, what are people actually capable of?
So let's unpack that. If I walked out onto the street and asked someone to define democracy, they'd probably say it's where the majority rules.
Or where everyone gets a vote.
Right. Is Adler saying that's wrong?
He's saying it's incomplete. Adler draws a really crucial distinction right at the start. He says we have to look at two different things.
Okay.
First, there's democracy as a constitutional form. That's the machinery citizens having formal rights, holding office, the legal structure.
All the stuff you'd read in a civics textbook.
Precisely. But then there's democracy as a social condition.
A social condition. That sounds a little more abstract. Is that just a vibe?
It's much more than a vibe. It's the tangible reality of equality in daily life. It implies a society where equality pervades the culture.
So it's about how people relate to one another.
Yes. Not just as voters, but as equals.
Yeah.
You can have the machinery of voting without the spirit of equality, and Adler would argue that's a very hollow democracy.
That makes sense. You could have an election, but if everyone is still bowing to a rigid class structure when they leave the booth, the spirit isn't really there.
Exactly.
But here's where it got really interesting for me. Reading this essay, I felt this deep underlying tension. It's like a battle going on between two views of humanity.
You've hit on the big question that Adler identifies. It really comes down to this. Do the masses, ordinary people like you and me, have the intellectual and moral capacity to govern themselves?
Or are we just too chaotic, too emotional, too easily manipulated?
Right. Do we need a babysitter?
That's it in a nutshell.
And that opposing view, which runs through history, claims people require guidance from an enlightened elite. If you believe that, then democracy is dangerous.
And Adler frames this as the fundamental battle.
Yes. Are citizens independent thinkers, or are they, as he puts it, objects of propaganda?
Objects of propaganda. That phrase gave me chills. It feels so relevant right now, but we'll get to that. Let's go back to the beginning.
To Athens.
Right, because we always talk about ancient Athens as the birthplace of all this.
We do, and Adler takes us right there.
Yep.
He talks about the Greek origins, mentioning figures like Solon and Lycurgus. The key concept they introduced was incredibly radical for its time.
Which was?
That in a constitutional government, citizens are ruled and rule in turn.
Rule and rule in turn. So you're not just a subject listening to a king, you actually get to take the wheel sometimes.
Exactly. But, and it's a huge but, we have to remember the limitation here.
Who were the people?
Well, they were a very exclusive club. Free adult males, no women, no slaves, no foreigners.
So it was democracy for the country club.
It was. And even with that limited group, the intellectual heavyweights of the time were not impressed.
You're talking about Plato.
I am. You really can't discuss the history of this idea without dealing with Plato. In the Republic, he is absolutely savage about democracy.
He thought it was a terrible idea.
He viewed it as dangerous. Plato argued that democracy inevitably degenerates into tyranny.
Mob rule.
He called it mob rule. His argument was that the masses lack wisdom. They're driven by emotion and appetite, not reason. So if you let the mob drive the ship, they'll crash it.
Because they'll listen to the guy who promises them candy, not the one who knows how to read the stars.
That's a perfect way to put it. And then a tyrant steps in to fix the chaos.
So what about Aristotle? He's usually the more practical one. Was he any more optimistic?
A little bit, but he was very cautious. In the Politics, Aristotle distinguishes between polity, which is a moderate, lawful democracy, and extreme democracy.
He actually used democracy as a negative term.
In that context, yes. He saw extreme democracy as the rule of the poor, used only to take from the rich and serve their own interests, not the common good.
So for the ancients, this wasn't some golden ideal. It was risky. It was unstable.
Very much so.
So how did we get from democracy as a dangerous mob to the Roman idea of law?
The Romans contributed something vital: the concept of mixed government. They looked at the three basic forms: rule by one, monarchy; rule by the few, aristocracy; and rule by the many, democracy.
And they said, why choose?
Exactly. The Roman Republic combined them. You had consuls acting like monarchs, the Senate represented the aristocracy, and the assemblies for the people.
Checks and balances.
The early version of it, yes. And Cicero, the great Roman orator, really emphasized that a republic has to be governed by the rule of law, not the arbitrary will of a mob or a king.
That legal structure is crucial.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we have the ancients saying it's risky, but maybe manageable with a mixed system. We fast forward through the Middle Ages, mostly kings and divine right. How do we get to we the people?
That shift is monumental. It happens through the evolution of what we call the social contract. Adler traces this through three key thinkers: Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau.
Let's break them down. Hobbes is the life is nasty, brutish, and short guy, right?
That's him. Thomas Hobbes. He argued that without government, we live in chaos. So people consent to an absolute authority just to stay alive. It's a contract based on fear.
Not exactly democratic.
No, but it establishes the idea that government comes from consent, not just from God. Then comes John Locke. He changes the game.
How so?
He says, yes, we consent, but we have natural rights: life, liberty, property. The government's job is to protect those rights. If it doesn't, the contract is broken.
That sounds very familiar. That's the DNA of the American Revolution.
It is. And then Jean-Jacques Rousseau takes it a step further with the general will. He argues that true democracy requires active participation. You don't just obey the law, you help create the law.
But there's the problem. Rousseau's idea works great in a small village. How do you do that in a massive country? You can't get millions of people in a room to vote on every law.
That was the specific challenge the American founders faced. And Adler highlights the genius of Madison and Hamilton in the Federalist Papers.
They argued for representative democracy.
Yes. Yeah.
So we hire people to do the governing for us.
In a sense. But Madison argued this was actually better than direct democracy. He thought that by filtering public views through a chosen body of citizens, you could refine the public voice.
It acts as a cooling mechanism.
It does. Plus, with a federal system in a large territory, you make it harder for one impassioned majority to take over everything. It's designed to prevent the very mob rule Plato was so scared of.
It's incredible. They were essentially having a conversation with Plato to cross 2,000 years. Okay, Plato, you say the mob is dangerous. Here's a system to tame it.
It's a continuous argument. It never stops.
Speaking of continuous arguments and refining our thinking, this seems like a perfect moment to take a quick breather.
A moment for reflection.
You guessed it. If you're enjoying this analysis and want to go even deeper into the world of books and ideas, you need to check out Mindful Moments. It is our YouTube channel, and it offers AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques. It's all about inspiring reflection and rational thought.
It really is a great resource for keeping these ideas fresh. Definitely worth a look.
Okay, back to the essay. We talked about the machinery of democracy, but let's go back to that idea of equality. Adler brings up Alexis de Tocqueville, the ultimate observer of American democracy.
Tocqueville is essential. He visited America in the 1830s, and what he saw wasn't just a political system. He saw a comprehensive social condition. He called it inequality of conditions.
What did he mean by that? I mean, not everyone was rich.
No, but the rigid inherited class structures of Europe were gone. There was a sense that no man was inherently better than another. A servant could become a master. But this brings us to a major conflict that Adler points out.
The economic conflict.
The economic conflict.
Because you can have the right to vote, but if you're starving, how much does it really matter?
That is the core of the debate between liberal Democrats and socialist Democrats, or the Marxist critique. Liberal Democrats tend to argue political equality is enough.
As long as the laws are fair and there's equal opportunity.
Then economic inequality is acceptable. It's the result of freedom, of different talents and efforts.
And the opposing side.
The socialist argument, which Marx championed, is that political democracy is a sham if the rich control everything. They say you need economic democracy, redistribution of wealth, worker control, to make the political vote actually mean something.
And Adler doesn't really pick a winner here, does he?
No, he notes that this tension is unresolved. It's an ongoing debate that every single democracy has to wrestle with.
How much economic inequality can you tolerate before it eats away at political equality?
And how much redistribution can you enact before you stifle liberty? There's no easy answer.
This brings me right back to the big question we started with. If Plato thought we were too dumb to rule, and if these economic forces are constantly trying to manipulate us, how does Adler think democracy actually survives?
This is where we get to the absolute heart of Adler's message. And the answer is one word: education.
It sounds simple, but I feel like he means something very specific by that, not just sitting in a classroom.
It does. Adler is very specific. He says the greatest danger to democracy is not a foreign army. It's not a bad economy. It's the reduction of the citizen to an object of propaganda.
That phrase again, it's haunting.
It is. If citizens are just sponges soaking up slogans, manipulated by whoever has the biggest megaphone, democracy is dead. It's just mob rule again.
So what's the solution?
Adler argues the solution is not to restrict the vote, not to limit rights, but to strengthen minds.
I love the quote he uses. Philosophy is everybody's business.
Yeah.
It's not just for professors in ivory towers. If you're a voter, you have to grapple with these big ideas. You have to be able to spot a bad argument.
Think about the contemporary relevance. We talk about fake news, the influence of algorithms.
It's exactly what Plato feared. Rhetoric over truth.
Exactly. And is what Adler is warning against. If we can't distinguish between a reasoned argument and an emotional manipulation, we're not really citizens, we're subjects.
That is a heavy responsibility. It means democracy is not a spectator sport.
It really isn't. And that connects to the tension between technocratic experts and popular opinion. We often hear, leave it to the experts, the issues are too complex.
Right.
But Adler would say, if you leave it entirely to the experts, you have given up on the democratic ideal. Ordinary people must be educated enough to make the final call.
So, wrapping this all up, where does Adler land? He's looked at the Greeks, the Romans, the social contract, the socialists. What's his synthesis?
Adler ultimately sides with Aristotelian moderation and the American founders' approach. He believes in the checks and balances, the mixed nature of the system, but he also emphasizes that we have made progress.
Real progress. We moved beyond the Greek exclusion of women and slaves.
Exactly. We have universal suffrage. We have expanded who counts as a person and a citizen, which is a massive moral achievement.
But Adler's final point is that democracy is not a done deal.
Not at all. It's not a trophy on the shelf. It is a way of life that requires active, educated participation every single day.
It's a garden you have to constantly water, or the weeds will take over.
That's a very good analogy for it.
So the key takeaway here is that our rights, our vote, our freedom, they depend entirely on our ability to think clearly.
Yes. And that leads to a provocative thought I'd like to leave you with. We spend so much time arguing about specific policies or politicians.
We do.
But if Adler is right, the real battlefield is our own minds. So I want to ask, does our current education system actually prepare us to be citizens? Does it teach us to analyze, to debate, to spot a lie? Or does it leave us vulnerable, perfectly designed to be objects of propaganda?
Wow. That is honestly a little terrifying, but it's exactly the right question to ask. We can't just assume we're safe because we have a constitution.
We have to do the work.
We really do. This has been an incredible deep dive into an essay that feels like it was written for this exact moment in history.
It really does feel that way.
Click the link on screen for more on this and other essay subjects. Make sure you subscribe, share, and if you can, purchase via the link. But most importantly, think rationally. See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go.